All right, I'd like to welcome to the show, returning to the show. We had him on actually fairly recently, Stephen Wertheim. He is a historian and the deputy director of the Quincy Institute. Stephen, welcome.
Hey, good to be back.
I'm still reeling from our talk about your book about the UN, and it has really, honestly, it has really, it's been something I've been thinking about quite a bit in terms of the implications of the UN in the world and our role in it. And you have written a piece with Benjamin Friedman, Say No, Joe, in Foreign Policy. And it is basically arguing that we should not be going back to the status quo. I want to talk to you about some of his appointments so far and who you anticipate may be future appointments in this field. But let's start with what Joe Biden, what he ran on, and then let's go from there.
Right. So on the one hand, Biden ran on something like a restoration. I mean, at times his rhetoric could get almost explicitly conservative in the sense of let's go back to the status quo before Trump. He had a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine that came out toward the beginning of this year, where implicitly he grouped all presidents prior to Trump since 1945. So that would include George W. Bush,
right,
as upholders of the liberal international order, U.S. leadership, etc. So there's been that element. And you see that element just in the past several days when he's saying America's back. And he's saying that to heads of state, heads of government around the world. On the other hand, I think we need to distinguish Joe Biden from candidates like Hillary Clinton, true believers in U.S. military intervention. I don't think Joe Biden is quite the same, right? Both of those figures have been firmly within the mainstream. Joe Biden has always been there himself. And of course, he supported the Iraq war and, to my mind, has never given a great explanation about why he did that, what he learned from it, et cetera. But he at least seems to understand where America is in the world right now and what Democratic voters and just voters in general, the American people, are thinking about their foreign policy. So since the war on terror started to go obviously haywire, he has been more cautious from within the mainstream about U.S. military operations, including opposing the surge in Afghanistan. From within the Obama administration, a lonely voice taking that point of view. And so he did in the campaign talk about bringing an end to the forever war. He did promise to essentially break from the late Obama policy of supporting the Saudi-led coalition in its war in Yemen. Said he would end U.S. support, even called Saudi Arabia a pariah on the Democratic debate stage. So he's not where I'd like him to be exactly on a whole range of issues, but I think it gives us something to work with.
Okay, so it's interesting the pieces say no, Joe, because there is a quality of like, we need to maybe strip down some stuff, as it were, before we build up and become proactive in some way in the way that we engage the world. And we seem to have, if I understand you correctly, there's two sort of constructions here. One is America's place in the world in terms of, like you say, the liberal establishment order, which was, and it's arguable, I think, as to when this started to really genuinely erode. I would argue that it did earlier than I think a lot of people are suggesting, but which had basically U.S. hegemony in one form or another around the world. I mean, we have 800, approximately, maybe 750 bases around the world, at least since the fall of the Soviet Union. we have perceived ourselves, if not others, having perceived us as a hyperpower. So that's, and then that's one sort of, I guess, rubric. And then the other is how much the military and intervention you use to maintain that status. Let's take the first one first, because it seems to me that, and to be fair, this was my assessment 4 years ago. It has not changed. That if I'm other countries in the world and I'm looking at America, like, to me, Sam Seder, I'm looking at America maybe, and I'm saying, because, I'm a doe-eyed optimist saying, like, Donald Trump is just, an anomaly. It's just a once-off fluke, and that's it. And we're gonna fix everything. We're not gonna go back to that. But if I'm from a different country, I'm looking at this and I'm going, like, if they can go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, why would a rational person like me from a different country think that they can't go to, Donald Trump Jr. after Joe Biden? I mean, we're an unstable country. Yeah. And there, it's like all you need to do. I don't know. I just remember like one anecdote where someone said, like, they were waiting on someone to pick them up and they didn't show after 10 minutes. And the people showed, they said, why'd you leave after 10 minutes? It's like, well, once you didn't show up at the time that you said you were going to, like, all bets are off as far as I'm concerned. And aren't we in that type of situation?
Why do we think Donald Trump is as bad as it can get? I mean, this is a failure of imagination.
In 2024, that could be a real life fascist if he was able to get past the Republican primary.
But the point being is that we're swinging between, like, the American public has basically said, we're not interested in that type of continuity that other people might be looking to us for.
That's right. And then if we go back before Obama, you have George W. Bush. Okay. So I do think that many other people around the world, other countries around the world, have a longer memory than some people who seem to have an interest in having a short memory in the town behind me, Washington. And so I think, we can say America's back and so forth, but it's going to be about results. It's going to be about, can the United States actually get a hold of its own conduct at home and abroad? That's the thing that will matter most, I think, both in the next 4 years and over the long term. And you've hit on such a crucial question. And this one is something that I'm hoping that the people around Biden are concerned with and capable of taking seriously. How comfortable are we? I mean, let's imagine that, the Biden team can implement as intelligent and nuanced an American foreign policy as it would like in the next 4 years, maybe in the next 8 years. What does it then mean to hand over the world's largest coercive apparatus to the next Donald Trump or worse? I mean, it didn't go that well under more responsible presidents.
Right.
Well, just then I have a question then when you say, looking forward, where we go from here. You mentioned ending the genocide in Yemen and the Saudi-led coalition there that the United States is funding. And obviously Biden has signaled that he wants to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal, even though there's been immense damage done in the past week with Israel killing their top scientists. So what do you foresee the Iran deal being able to be successfully re-implemented? And then also, what hope is there for other similarly positive coalition building moves by the Biden camp?
The president-elect came out with some nice statements just this morning in the New York Times in conversation with Tom Friedman, of all people, saying essentially that he wanted to have a clean re-entry into the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. In other words, he seemed to be resisting the impulse to use Trump's completely inappropriate sanctions and punishment of Iran for complying with the deal as leverage to try to get a quote unquote better deal. So that's very positive. Let's hope he does that. But it's going to be difficult. As you mentioned, the damage, some damage has been done quite a bit, and we don't know what will happen between now and Biden's inauguration. And so whether Iran is at this point willing to come back into compliance, given that Biden himself for 4 years, for 8 years may be willing, but what's happened has happened, and what may be happening in the future has to be taken into consideration. That's an open question. What I hope the Biden camp will realize is that the old nuclear deal was living on borrowed time in our own political system. And so we've actually got to go bigger, bolder, if we're going to achieve the result that some were hoping for. I mean, we don't just need to have a nuclear agreement with Iran. We need to systematically pursue a policy of disentangling the United States from the political and military conflicts in the region. Doesn't suit our interest. Sure hasn't worked out very well for people across the Middle East, even if it works out well for certain governments which are unsavory and poorly for other governments which are unsavory. And so to take the Iran issue, step one, in my view, is re-entering the JCPOA, that we should be heading toward a course of normalizing relations with Iran, in addition to undoing our over-identification of our own interests with another set of pretty bad actors in the region, Saudi Arabia, whom Biden called a pariah, UAE, Egypt, Israel.
All right, I want to circle back to that because those are one of the 5 points in your piece. But I just want to stay on that broader question for a moment, which is, if we cannot, I mean, and I guess this is the question I have. If the perception of us as an unstable partner long term is accurate in terms of these, from the perspective of the world, broadly speaking, right? I mean, both regardless of whether we perceive them as allies or competitors or whatever, just, there was a consistency to American foreign policy, for better, for worse. I would argue in some instances, maybe a little bit worse, but nevertheless, there was this notion of we project our power, we're the hyperpower, we have this hegemony. Is there an ability to reckon with that within the Biden administration, which says like, hey, you know what? Maybe we're not going to be the hyperpower. Maybe it is in our best interest to simply be, one of 4, one of 5, or, because it seems to me that we're still living under the Project for a New American Century idea of, we keep these low level conflicts going on around the world and keep everybody busy so nobody can amass enough power to compete with us. And that seems to be over. Like, what is the new project for this century? And is it maybe not going to be an American one?
I think that the senior advisors around Biden recognize that the so-called unipolar moment that the United States enjoyed at the end of the 1990s was just that. It's a moment and it's past. And actually, the Trump administration has recognized the same thing in its national security strategy. The problem is that, this could lead you in broadly one of two directions. You can say, okay, the United States, didn't even play its incredibly favorably hand well in the most propitious circumstances imaginable. Why should we think it's going to get better going forward? Let's recalculate what threats we face, what our interests are, and judiciously pull back our military force around the world. That's basically what I'm for. But what the Trump administration, the Pentagon in particular, has done is say, oh, this is a problem, and now we need to get tougher. Now that we face a world with great power competitors, near peer competitors, Russia and China, we didn't expect them to rise, and now they're, doing bad things. And so now we've got to focus on them, even as we continue to not be able to wind down our own wars in the Middle East and elsewhere. And, I think that there's actually mainstream bipartisan agreement on that score, and that's troubling. And so I worry that some of the senior people around Biden basically are going to continue this notion of great power competition to orient the United States, which can provide an argument for getting out of the Middle East in order to focus on China in particular. But I think that's an attempt to cling to as much military dominance as possible in conditions that have obviously changed internationally and domestically. I don't think that would be sufficient to bring about the change that we need.
That's basically the first point of 5 that you make in the foreign policy piece, which is the Biden administration should not pursue global military dominance. And where, I mean, I don't know if that's so. Let's move on to point 2, because I want to maybe circle back into that, because the question of China and relative, like, what global military dominance means in an era where China is at least perceived to be ascendant.